Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many people along
Hello.
for today's webinar. Hope everybody's keeping well. It's a beautiful, beautiful sunny day down here in Waterford. So I hope it's nice where you are. And you're very welcome along to our May final day of May. And yesterday was actually International Day of the Potato, in case you didn't know. So we're very, very excited.
I didn't know.
Richard didn't know that. We're very excited about that. And in this week's session, we're going to be talking about raised beds primarily, but we've also got some questions, and very happy to get your questions in the chat as well as we go. So we're going to kick off, I think, with a bit of a chat about raised beds. Richard, before we do, how have things been for the month weather-wise? You professional gardeners are always giving out about the weather, so what have you got?
No, I'm actually not. It's been the savior of Irish horticulture and agriculture, to be honest. It's been a very soft month with as long as you're prepared to work whenever. It was dry weekends or whatever. We managed to get virtually everything in now, and there's been plenty of sun as well. So I'm actually not complaining. We've been desperately trying to catch up and get everything in. Possibly complaining about the workload, but then you have to move when you move. And I think all farmers, growers all over the country have been moving flat out and hopefully catching up.
It's almost disappointing that you're not grumbling about something, Richard.
Oh, do you want me to find things to grumble about, Mick? With you as my boss, I'm never short of things to moan about, you know.
Okay, well, look, let's talk about raised beds first. We've got plenty of questions have come in as well in advance, so we'll try and get to those. But let's talk about raised beds first. And I suppose I'm a huge fan of raised beds. I'll say that, and I have a kind of, I suppose, a jaundiced view of Richard's view of raised beds, which is
well, I think they're very good for amateur gardeners who have limited mobility, you know. So if you like them, Mick, there we go.
I knew you were going to do the reduced mobility thing. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting session because I think Richard and I will be have somewhat contrary views to each other anyway about these things. So so let's start on that point, okay? What are the pros and cons of raised beds? I'll maybe go with the pros, okay, and then you can do the cons. How about that?
Well, I'm happy. I mean, being serious about it, I'm happy to add a few pros as well. But
okay.
I will explain where I'm coming from on the raised beds thing.
Okay, well, let me start with what I think are the pros then. And you're not allowed to jump into rebut.
I'm just going to get a coffee, Mick. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, so first pro, I find raised beds, good way of getting a kind of good depth of good quality soil in a very, if you've got a very unpromising soil in your garden like I do. They seem to, I think, heat up a little bit quicker than the rest of the soil around them. They're very good for you know, very free draining typically, so you get good sort of drainage through them. Sometimes too much, I would say, maybe a bit of a con, but can be done very cheaply. You can get started with your growing without very quickly, without all of the backbreaking work that you gardeners seem to love. And
the real work, Mick.
They can be also very very cheaply done as well.
I'm not sure about that.
I think, well, they can if you've got some timber lying around and you're anyway handy. And they're also, I just think, psychologically, for the busy home grower, they're much more straightforward. I think you can go out and hoe one bed in an evening, and you don't have to worry about, you know, the big area of open space getting you know, all weedy and getting out of control. If you've got gravel paths or wood chip paths around them, you know, you can get out even on a fairly wet day and you're not going to get your good shoes all mucked up, which is obviously very important consideration for a lot of us. Yeah, I love them. So I had a big area of open space in my veg patch at home, and got rid of it all and put in raised beds and gravel paths, and I couldn't be happier about that. And actually, just to really rub it into Richard, his son actually helped me build the raised beds, to just completely add insult to injury. So I'm a huge fan.
You paid him well, so he didn't complain.
I'm a huge fan of raised beds and will be till my dying day. So there, over to you for cons, Richard.
Well, no, first, on a serious note, they're very good for part-time amateur growers, as you were saying, and they do make it easier and so on. My fundamental point is really two things. One, that it provides a barrier for people who think, I have people talking to me and think you have to do it. So all you need to grow veg is a bit of soil and a packet of seeds. It can be remarkably cheap. There's a large expense in making raised beds, which is great if you have a few bob and you want a nice, easy, tidy garden, suburban garden. So on that basis, they're great. But there's a feeling abroad now that you have to have a raised bed to grow veg. So that is where I'm coming in, really. And I very much encourage people to have a look at their soil in the garden and just use it. You know, there's also, go with the raised bed thing, a feeling you have to import soil, which is removing a lot of the more fundamental thing. When you get into growing, you get into a whole world of working with nature and working with the incredible ecosystem which is in the soil. And I suppose I see raised beds a little bit as sort of entry level growing, sort of gardening light. But certainly, in all seriousness, they are very handy, very neat, and very expensive. And don't allow you to take the next stage, you just really get stuck in managing the soil, managing an ecosystem, which is where my fundamental love of growing comes from, I suppose. And I can't imagine if I'd have been fiddling around with raised beds as a young fellow when I got in love with growing things. I can't imagine raised beds would have had the same impact on me as working on the soil, you know. So that's my fundamental problem. But we'll get that out the way. And we're here today to talk about how to manage them, how to be successful. And there can be a very successful way of growing things if you manage things in a certain way. But if you are making them, you mentioned there a bit of timber lying around. You really, I think, are at nothing unless you use treated timber, because obviously the timber is lying there full of wet soil and will rot in our climate very, very rapidly. And there can be an issue with treated timber, with the fungicides and so on, and it coming out into the soil. But I kill two birds with one stone. We have a standard. I mean, I've made enough of them here. It's not as if I don't do raised beds. We use. Oh, I get a roll actually here.
And Richard, we can all see on the shelves behind you as well. Like you've a whole shelves full of equipment for making raised beds, like chainsaws and all sorts of interesting power tools behind you there.
That's just to make me look macho and hardy, really. You know. I've got my cut flowers over the other side. But this when we're making the raised beds, we use this stuff, which is damp proof course for buildings.
Yeah.
And this is the sort of height. I mean, it's got the millimeters here, 450 millimeters, 18 inches. And that's, we use two planks, two 9-inch planks. And this goes on the inside. It does two things. It stops any leakage of fungicides and so on from the wood into the soil, but also, which is crucial, stops the bed dying out. If it dries out, you'll get really poor growth. That means you're keeping the water in the bed. So we just use treated timber and line it with that stuff around the inside.
Okay, so sorry, just so I'm clear on that, what you're saying is it'll protect the timber, it'll protect the timber from rotting, it'll protect any nasty stuff that's in the timber from getting into the soil. But then the third thing you mentioned, which I didn't know, it'll prevent the bed itself from drying out because
timber is porous to water. Yeah.
Aha. Okay, that's a really good one.
Okay, very important because otherwise you're going to be watering your raised bed continually in a dry summer, whereas that stuff keeps the water in.
That's brilliant. I really like that. And we can testify to the fact that untreated timber will warp and rot literally within a year or a couple of years. So it's definitely not worth doing that. So even though you might feel like treated timber is not something you want to use with somewhere where you're growing your beds, you absolutely do need that for longevity. Now, interestingly, Richard, I've heard you speaking about concrete, and I was at Bloom yesterday, and I saw a raised bed made from concrete, kind of lintels that you'd buy in a garden centre, and you would feel that that's not a great thing from a carbon emissions perspective. So do you want to just speak to that? Because concrete,
you do listen to what I say, then, Mick.
Yeah, every now and then. I have an area in the back of my brain somewhere around here where I store Richard facts, and I filter them for, like, sometimes I listen and sometimes I don't.
Well, it's your prerogative as a CEO, I suppose. So yes, with concrete, the big issue is the production of concrete as it's made now. Various people are working on it, but produces a huge amount of CO2. And I did some calculations a year or two ago, and there is a CO2 saving growing your own veg. But if you made your raised beds out of concrete, I think it was 120 years of CO2 savings from veg growing paid back the CO2 produced by the concrete. Whereas if you make them from timber, then obviously that's a store of carbon. It's better than carbon neutral. So please don't make them with concrete. Concrete is a bit of an environmental disaster how it's made at the moment.
Okay, so let's talk then about basics of size and shape. You already said when you're building one, you're using kind of 2 planks high. So I guess that's what, about 40 to 50 centimeters?
Yeah. Now, in terms of height, plants need a good, well, ideally meter, but certainly 60 centimeters of soil to go into if they're going to cope with any dry weather and not need watering all the time. So our raised beds are all on soil, which I break up with a pickaxe. So it's draining. And then onto that, we put 45 centimeters of raised bed. But the plants have access to soil underneath. Now, if you were in a very urban site, and I know some schools like this in the cities where they only have concrete or tarmac, and you're building on top of that, then you would need an extra row of planks and make it at least 60 centimeters of soil to give the plants enough space. So depth is important, but the depth can include what's underneath the raised bed if it's soil, if it's broken up. In terms of width, what you're doing is ensuring that you can reach into the middle. And you should ideally make yourself a bespoke bed with the right width. And you measure how far you can reach comfortably into the middle of a bed. And that varies a little bit between people. And then double it, because the whole point is you're reaching in from the sides both ways. No, it's normally about 1 meter. But I'm getting a bit longer in the tooth now. I used to be 1.2 meters, used to be great. Probably a little bit less than that now. But some people, for instance, I made some raised beds for my sister-in-law, who a relatively short woman with a back that's a little bit damaged these days, and her beds were 90 centimeters wide. So make them that fit yourself, and that's comfortably reaching the middle. I don't mean stretching as hard as you can go, comfortably work in the middle, make it enjoyable. And that's the width you need, and the length can be anything you want.
Yeah.
You know, that you could have one 1 kilometer long if you felt like it, if you got enough timber. But the width is your own width.
Yeah. So the reason we want to be able to reach into the middle is so that we don't ever have to stand on the bed. And
Yes.
I when I was not the hugely experienced grower that I am now, a long time ago, I built some triangular raised beds in my garden, which I thought looked very lovely, and they were made from railway sleepers, so they were probably wrong on every level, basically, if I'm honest. And of course, because of the triangular shape, I couldn't reach into the center at all, and they were pretty much disastrous, and a lot of wasted space in the corners as well. So we're saying 1 point, or as wide as you can reach into the center, probably around 1.2 meters.
Vary between 90 centimeters and 1.2 meters.
And you'll notice that I didn't follow up or slag you off about your increasingly reduced mobility as well. So that's very, very kind of me.
Well, when I have to resort to raised beds, Mick, I'll retire. Yeah, that's what they're for, actually.
All right, so we're saying build them with timber, make them 1.2 meters wide or something close to that, as long as you want. And then, yeah, you can obviously buy them. Lots of places out there that will sell you a raised bed if you want. And
some of them are absolute rubbish with untreated timber. We were given some here, and I won't mention the name of the company who supplied them, but I put them up, and within about 2 months, they'd warped so badly that the screws are pulling out of the corners. So if you're buying them, make sure the timber is of reasonable thickness. In old money, because you buy timber in old money, as it were, an inch, nominal inch, and make sure it's treated. And for the corners, I use treated 4x4 timber or 3x4 to make your corner that you drill. You put screws in to hold the edges on.
Yeah. Okay. And there is, Catherine, I don't know if you're able to find this real quick, but there is a video on our website, I think, that shows how to make a raised bed. It's a very simple frame, effectively, that you're just strengthening in the corners, and then if it's long, I suppose if it was 3 meters long, you probably need to strengthen the middle as well, perhaps with a little bit of timber as well. Somebody's asking there, what do you think of using scaffold planks?
Yeah, they're treated, and if you have any connection to the building trade, you can often pick them up quite cheaply. So that'd be great. But make sure you line them with damp-proof course.
Yeah. And she's also asking what we think of galvanized. I don't think we're a big fan of galvanized. We bought some for Grow HQ as planters, and they're not great, quite frankly. They look lovely originally, but they're not brilliant now.
No, I seriously lacerated my hands putting them together. It was, and I don't think I'm overusing the term lacerated. It was quite hideous. But you often cut your hands when you're working on them. I curse them every time I have to do any weeding in them. But they don't normally keep their shape. But I mean, if you happen to have some lying around and you don't mind getting the odd cut, there's a carbon cast with steel, but it's not as bad as the carbon cast of concrete.
Also, I'd imagine they're inclined to bake in the summer if you've got a tall sheet of galvanized steel and it heats up. It would bake the soil as well, wouldn't it?
I think it could, yeah. That's wood is an insulator both ways. So wood is by far my favorite material for them.
Okay. And then the big question, let's assume somebody's starting with a lawn, Richard, right? So they put their timber frame down on the grass. How should they fill it, or what should they do next?
Well, it's always better, in my view, to use soil, not potting compost, because soil is a very dynamic chemical and biological material. And as long as you keep adding compost or something like that to it, it will keep you going indefinitely. Will look after soil and it will feed you indefinitely. Potting compost grows great stuff the first year, but because it doesn't have that complex biology and chemistry, it just runs out of nutrients, and you're pretty much reduced to digging it out and putting more in. So you certainly can very successfully grow every year if you're prepared to replace the compost, but it runs out of steam is basically what happens. So soil if you can.
Yeah. Okay. So it's often a challenge, I know, from the various different courses we do for people to get enough soil, and some people would say, oh, you get it. I got some on Dundee or whatever, and then the soil was horrendous. It was full of stones or full of weeds or whatever. So, like, if you need to get a ton bag of a soil and compost mix or something like that, I know garden centers do increasingly do that kind of stuff, and there's various companies out there like Enrich and others who do good quality soil.
It makes gardening very uneconomic. If I suppose coming back to my initial feelings about raised beds, that's a great way to get yourself an interesting hobby. But economically, you'd be much better off buying your veg from Marks and Spencer's. It's a very.
You're not really suggesting that though, right? Because like let's take this back to somebody in a classic 3-bed semi-detached garden where the builder came in after they were finished building the house and just put like a centimeter of topsoil on top of rubble, and they have to put raised beds in. Like, absolutely, they're going to have to buy in topsoil for it. Like, and that's.
You're not actually. I mentioned earlier about making them for my sister-in-law at that stage when they moved into a new build, and it's a matter of which isn't as done. I mean, yeah. I'm not. It's a great way to do it with the bringing in soil and so on. You get a lovely garden to use. Which great if you can afford it, great. But there are other ways, and sorting out the rubble from the soil, and you create paths with the rubble, and you put the soil into the raised bed, and you're basically moving it apart, and it a little bit of hard work, but people seem to spend a fortune on gym membership, and it created a night when they made them a compost heap, and you can do that. And I know it's lovely for people to be able to set these things up, but they're the old skills of creating gardens, which I suppose I encourage, but I'm realistic. And obviously, if you can afford it, bring the soil in.
Yeah. But if you're going to bring it in, you want to get good quality, I suppose. So again, coming back to that question, if you were starting with grass and you put your raised bed down, you're saying, like, is it a mix of soil and compost you want to do, or just soil and then sort of go at trying to build up the nutrition over the years, or what would you say?
I would go with basic topsoil, and you can get some rubbish in, but when I've needed a bit of topsoil here, when we were landscaping in areas and so on, I got in touch with a commercial guy who clears building sites effectively. They move the topsoil one site to another. In a previous life, I used to be involved in that sort of thing. And that's the cheapest way to get topsoil as they're clearing a building site. And then adding your own compost and a little bit of fertilizer is the best way to treat it. You can also, if it's quite poor soil, like we had the raised beds in the TV garden, it was subsoil really from the garden here. Just to get it moving for the first year, I worked potting compost, a relatively small amount of potting compost just into the surface of the soil to get a seed bed and so on. And after that, playing around compost. But you can buy the stuff with compost in, and it's not cheap, but that gives you an instant garden, which is what you're after. Great,
Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions we got in advance asked about that. So can you fill a raised bed with compost only? So I presume they mean potting compost, and I suppose you've answered that. I think that
Yes, interesting enough, if it's your own compost, as you know, Mick, I did a bit of a trial in one of the tunnels here, and we had the tunnels put horizontally on ground that was sloping, and I made up the soil at the back corner of the tunnel, about 50 centimeters, 60 centimeters of it, by making compost in situ, worm compost. And it actually makes a very good growing media on its own. But I mean, that's because we have such large amounts of worm compost. It was an interesting experiment for me. But you can grow in neat compost if you want to. But it's I doubt many people would have that much compost to do that.
I'm assuming this person means potting compost, which
if they do, I answered that one then.
Yeah, we answered that. A good question here then, like, well, someone says, do you ever need to change the soil in a raised bed? I think we've answered that as well.
Oh yeah, definitely work on your soil. If you're using, ordinary soil, the standard measure is 1 bucket of homemade compost or well-rotted farmyard manure per square meter. And if you do that once or twice a year, you'll end up with a soil that gets better and better and better and easier to work.
Yeah. Interesting question then here, actually. Are planting distances different in a raised bed? So I would always assume no, but
is what, sorry?
Are the planting distances any different in a raised bed? So in other words, are you following the same spacing that you would out in the open ground?
You are, because there's all sorts of impacts of spacing, which I won't go into, but plant size, earliness of yield and so on. But standard spacings, what I would always use in a raised bed.
Yeah. And if you've got your standard, like if you've got a 1 or a 1.2 meter wide raised bed, then you're probably going to get like 3 rows, for most things, like 30 centimeters between rows, that kind of idea.
Well, I would put the rows across the bed, not down the bed.
Oh, would you?
Yeah, much easier to go across, because then you're working from the edge, hand weeding or whatever, and you can hoe between the rows. So I always go across the bed.
Yeah. Then there's Tara was asking a question here. This is, I think, speaks to a lot of the things we've been talking about. She says, when you're situated in rural Ireland on bog and blue till, raised beds are a necessity, but are we doing the environment more harm by importing soil with transport, etc., to grow in raised beds? Or
yes.
Are we doing the environment good by primarily eating our own homegrown food from the raised beds? So there you go. The good follow-up question she made.
It depends on your motivation for gardening, I suppose. And it's lovely to have some nice fresh veg, or to get your kids interested, or a lovely hobby, which I wouldn't knock at all. But you remember my calculations I did the other year, Mick? We had a session discussing them. And if you're using concrete blocks to make your beds, and then you're bringing in peat-based compost, it's an absolute environmental disaster. It'd probably be as well to fly off to Spain every week to pick up your tomatoes,
So
slight exaggeration, but
we're not recommending that at all. So like
no, not at all. So if you are using potting compost, certainly use peat-free, because the environmental impact, the carbon impact of peat extraction is absolutely horrific.
Yeah, no, but I think what we're saying as our gold standard is timber raised beds with soil in them, as opposed to potting compost.
Yes, and that is a much more sustainable thing.
Yeah, and get your compost or farmer manure.
Because the environmental cost of moving the soil, again, you remember the work I did. It doesn't bringing soil in a lorry a few miles is not a massive carbon cost.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Tara. That's a really good question. Bernie is saying he or she, I'm not sure, has rotting wooden planks. What could I use to replace them? So I think we've talked about that.
I saw a comment go up, actually. Very good one. Somebody was saying use larch. And certain types of timber don't rot. I mean, larch is expensive. I I have a log cabin extension at home, and we had to use some larch to replace rotting timbers, and it certainly wasn't cheap. But that you don't have to have it treated, but I would still, which could be a nice environmental thing, but you will still need to line it with plastic because, like any timber, it's permeable to water.
Yeah. Owen was asking, is the use of glass covered raised beds effective in extending the growing season? So I'm
Oh,
assuming
very much, yeah.
he's talking about old windows or something like that, maybe as a sort of like creating a mini glass house on top of your raised bed.
Yes, and in fact, I did. I can't remember. It wasn't when I was teaching here, somewhere else. Anyway, the idea that if you very easy, if you're in any way handy, to make a wooden frame that fits it onto your raised bed, and that can be covered in plastic to make a mini tunnel. You could also have one for the summer, which is net. Like here, we have an horrific pigeon problem, and as Mick has been counselling me this morning, we have a horrific pheasant problem on our new site, eating everything up. So you could have a frame that you put different things on, and certainly if you have old windows, with the proviso that one of the commonest ways people used to injure themselves when I was younger on horticultural holdings was moving Dutch lights and so on around, the glass panes. People fell through them and all sorts of things. So they are potentially dangerous. You've got kids in the garden who wouldn't dream of it.
Yeah.
And your kids love kicking balls around, Mick, so they'd last about 2 minutes, wouldn't they, if you had glass? Yeah, that would be great. And handy people can often recycle or upcycle, I think the word is now, isn't it? And yes, you make the most out of your raised bed by having some protection to extend the season. Yeah.
So Kira is asking about horsetail. Her neighbor horsetail from her neighbor's garden has invaded her newly constructed raised beds.
Oh, no.
She doesn't want to use chemicals. So
No.
it's kind of a digging out as best you can, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember as a child, Dad had it on some of his land, and I could have ended up an accountant really if I'd have carried on doing it. But having it just digging deep trenches to get it out, it's not nice in that situation. I might be quite tempted to make the beds deeper and cover them with a ground cover, like commonly called Mypex, but the perforated plastic, to stop it creeping in and up, because apart from Japanese knotweed, it's the most annoying weed I've ever come across.
Mm.
So
Okay,
sorry, I'm being a bit downbeat there, but yeah, maybe use the raised beds and cover them over, and then have 60 centimeters of soil above the ground cover, so they can't grow in.
Michelle, they're asking about recycled plastic boards for raised beds. So I did come across someone who'd used old election posters, so there'll be a lot of them around after next Friday in Ireland.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, you wouldn't have any issue.
But yes, build yourself. I did actually once use a few old election posters for a quick bed. And yes, you'd need to make a wooden frame and then drill it, screw it onto that. But I should imagine it would be quite a long-term solution, and it wouldn't be porous to water. So that sounds quite a good idea to me.
Mm.
But it would need a wooden frame.
David there is asking in the chat, he's away in August for a month. How can he keep his raised beds hydrated? He's got a mix of beans, peas, carrots. Can I rely on rain alone? Well, maybe, but maybe not if it's a dry spell.
I wish you could rely on the climate. We can't anymore. In an average Irish summer, you'd be okay. When I was a student, I had an allotment. This was in the UK, to feed myself, and obviously I disappeared for the summer. Not quite as long as the Irish students get, but I was disappearing in June and coming back actually in early October. And I planned everything to be ready when I came back, and it worked. That was in the south of England, which would be drier than here. if you have a well-structured soil with plenty of depth to it, like I was saying, at least 60 centimeters of soil, and you don't have things too close, and you have a good store of water when you go away, make sure the soil isn't anyway dry, the chances are there'll be enough rain in August to come back to crops.
Okay, or maybe have a friendly neighbor on standby just in case. Somebody else there says bindweed has invaded.
You're breaking up, Mick. There, I've lost you completely now.
Oh, have you?
Can you hear me, Mick? You've gone.
I can hear you perfectly. Yes. Can nobody hear me at all?
I can hear you, Mick, but you're not moving.
Oh, okay, I'll turn my video off for a second. Oh, they can hear me still. Okay, brilliant. So somebody has said bindweed has invaded the raised beds. Another nasty kind of invasive weed.
It is. The roots aren't quite as deep as horsetail, and you can keep on top of that to some extent. Dig it out, you know, the big white roots that are easy to find whenever you're flicking the soil over. And if in the summer you pull any growth, do it on a weekly basis. They shouldn't cause too much problem, as long as you keep systematically on top of it.
Okay. So let me just see, did we cover all of the raised beds topics that we said we were going to? Yeah, so I think we did. Well, one point that we maybe didn't is, like, if you have a choice on where to put the raised beds in your garden, let's say you've got, you know, I don't know, decent sized back garden and there's plenty of space, like, does it, like, where to put them for best? I'm assuming it's optimal sunlight and, you know, plenty of shelter from wind.
Yes,
it'd be the usual
absolutely.
rules that would apply to any siting any veg patch, really, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, when I'm doing classes here, I do talk about the 3 S's, which is soil, sun, and shelter, which determines where you're going to site a garden. You're at nothing trying to grow veg in shade.
Yeah.
A little bit of shade at the beginning or the end of the day is fine, but fundamentally you want sunlight throughout the day. And critically, if you want to grow things through the winter, anything shading the garden, obviously the shadows are very long then and the sun's low in the sky. It's very handy to know how far the shadow creeps on Christmas Day, because even if it's shaded for a couple of months, you know, November, December, January, or whatever, you're not going to be able to grow the winter crops. And you keep the ground with something growing in it all the time in your raised bed to make much use. So there's winter crops like leeks or kale. Any spare ground, I put corn salad and winter purslane in, you know, ground cover stroke salad crop. So you make sure it gets year-round sun, if at all possible. And shelter, we live in a windy island as well, and very good idea to be sheltered from prevailing winds, you know, coming from the southwest, but also the ones that Scuppia transplants in April, which are the cold easterlies that come in. So shelter from both directions would be good there.
Okay, just looking through some of the comments in the chat there from earlier. So Robert was saying some councils give away compost at recycling centres. That's good advice as well.
Great, yeah.
Somebody else was asking about the minimum width for raised beds. I think we covered that, about, you know, 1 to 1.2 meters.
As wide as you can comfortably work in. You know, because you get more for your buck there. And actually, in terms of cost of making them, the longer they are, the less timber you need.
Yeah.
And so it's better to have one raised bed of 5 meters than 5 raised beds of 1 meter, you know, in terms of the cost.
Yeah, and also to say that the raised beds that I have at home that Richard's son made for me, very very capable carpenter he is as well, are about 4 meters long, most of them. So they are nice and long and about 1.2 meters wide. Somebody used stone to make their bed and sent us some lovely pictures of them as well. So that's Patricia. She says the slugs and snails don't like the stone, which sounds like a good positive as well.
Mhm.
There, they look like
I
they look like stones, maybe from left over from building or building a wall or something like that.
Yeah, I come from a hilly part of England where we make dry stone walls, and I terraced a garden for my dad many years ago. You know, you make doing a dry stone retaining wall on a series of terraces. Um, uh, the one issue I would have, certainly the slugs like that, but that would have been sandstone, the material we use there. But the width of the stone to make a substantial wall, you're going to have, I would have thought, at least 20 centimeters of space taken with the stones. So lovely decorative feature in a garden. If you've got the stone, great. But you will lose some width on the bed.
Yeah. Okay, and then maybe a final question, two kind of non-raised bed questions, and we might get through these quickly, Richard, because we're at more or less at the end. Are there any cons to using a two or three layers of cardboard to block weeds and making holes to sow transplants through? So that's an interesting one. It's kind of like a cardboard Mypex effect.
Yeah, it can work really well. And it acts as a mulch, but you'd want to keep an eye on slugs because they love living under damp cardboard and eating your pumpkins or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. And actually, Richard, I meant to say to you, I saw on Instagram this morning somebody sharing a video of.
An Insta what?
It's don't worry about it. I saw
Oh,
a
okay.
thing. I saw a thing online where somebody was despairing at the amount of plastic in module trays and all of that kind of stuff, and was growing, had been raising seedlings, tomato seedlings, in a timber like a pallet box, effectively, lined with sheep's wool, and found that worked very well. I thought that was just an interesting.
Interesting, but you seed trays last virtually a lifetime. I mean, considering the amount of plastic that is used in the average home, my seed trays, I have some that are 20 years old and still fine, you know. So the plastic's being used, but plastic isn't a problem that isn't being disposed of. It's just
Yeah.
a material we can use. So I wouldn't personally be bothered with that myself, really.
I had a funny feeling you might say that. I thought it was a great idea. So congratulations to that Instagrammer. And then Michael earlier on had asked about grapevines. They were pruned back earlier in the year, but the branches have grown very vigorously.
Yeah,
In
I pruned mine
weeks.
3 times. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's worried about the canopy of shading light and sun from other vegetables.
Yeah, we have one in a glass house here. And the critical thing in a glass house or polytunnel is to have it on the north side. And so it doesn't, it's free, if you like, because it's not shading the other crops in any way. And in terms of pruning, and if you have the roots outside, you don't even have to water it. Pruning, I would prune 3 times in the summer because they keep growing all the time to allow some light to get to the fruit. So Chef will be getting a load of vine leaves to do chefy things with next week. And I will be pruning them back for the 2nd time this year, next week.
Okay. We might come back to what Chef would be doing with the vine leaves. But anyway, we're going to have to leave it there because it's 2:00. Thanks everybody for joining us. Don't forget.
Thank you.
Myself and Richard do these sessions on the last Friday of every month. There's also loads of online courses. You can check them out in the shop, and indeed real world courses, including, I think, coming up in June, I think around the 20th of June, we have a weekend ultimate starter course, which is a day with Richard, and then more importantly, a day with me also here at Pro HQ.
Some people go after the first day, but you know. Oh, and also I have a course weekend after next, which is Gardening for the Planet, which is how to garden in an environmentally sensitive way. So I know this place is left on there. So if anybody's interested, that's Sunday week in the garden here.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a whole load of loads of other stuff happening as well. So if please do check that out. Yes, they are on the website, Mary. And we've got a summer solstice dinner coming up in Grow HQ on the shortest day of the year. I think it's a Friday. Loads of other stuff on our website as well. So check that out. And the GIY website is a brilliant resource for loads of videos and tips and veg directories and all that stuff. So do check that out. Have a brilliant bank holiday weekend for those of you who are based in Ireland.
Happy gardening.
Happy gardening. It looks like the weekend's going to be kind weather-wise, so enjoy it. Thanks, Richard, for your time. Thanks, Catherine, and we'll talk to you all soon.